A handful of merchants on a tiny volcanic rock once held the entire world hostage over something you probably have in your kitchen right now. Nutmeg, not gold, not diamonds, a simple spice that grows on trees. But this wasn't just any spice. For over 1,000 years, nutmeg had only grown in one place on Earth, the Banda Islands, a cluster of volcanic rocks in the middle of nowhere, smaller than Manhattan, lost in the vast Indonesian archipelago. And whoever controlled those islands controlled the global economy. The year is 1599. A handful of Dutch merchants are sailing toward these legendary islands in ships that are barely holding together. Their clothes are rotting. Their food supplies are running low. Half their crew is dead from scurvy and disease. They're desperate. For centuries, Arab traders and Venetian merchants had grown unimaginably wealthy from this trade. They bought nutmeg for almost nothing in the Banda Islands, then sold it in European markets for prices that would make a drug dealer blush. A pound of nutmeg in London cost more than a cow. The Dutch had tried everything to break into this monopoly. They'd sent expeditions around Africa. They'd attempted to negotiate with the Portuguese. They'd even tried growing nutmeg in their own colonies. Nothing worked. These islands were their last shot, their final gamble. If they could somehow establish a foothold here, if they could convince the local rulers to trade with them instead of their established partners, they might just survive as a trading nation. But they had no idea what they were walking into. The Banda Islands weren't just some remote tropical paradise waiting to be discovered. They were a sophisticated trading hub that had been doing business with the outside world for over a millennium. The local chiefs, the Orang Kaya, had grown rich and powerful by carefully managing relationships with competing merchants from across Asia. They weren't naive islanders who could be easily fooled by European trinkets. These men understood global markets better than most European merchants. They knew exactly how valuable their nutmeg was. They knew that merchants would sail for months, risk their lives, lose entire crews, just for the chance to fill their cargo holds with these precious seeds. And they had absolutely no reason to trust a handful of half-dead Dutchmen who'd just washed up on their shores. The Dutch captain, Jacob van Heemskerk, stood on the deck of his ship as the Banda Islands came into view, lush green peaks rising from crystal blue water. Paradise, if you didn't know better. But he could see the other ships in the harbour. Portuguese vessels, Arab dhows, Chinese junks, all here for the same reason. He was about to enter a game where the stakes were higher than he could possibly imagine. What happened next would reshape the global economy and turn a company of Dutch merchants into the most powerful corporation in human history. Van Heemskerk had no idea he was about to witness the birth of corporate warfare. Within months, those desperate Dutch merchants weren't just buying spices. They were buying entire islands, not through negotiation, through systematic destruction of everyone else trying to do business. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had just raised more money than any organisation in human history. $8 billion in today's terms. And they had one simple plan: corner the market completely. Here's where it gets insane. They didn't just want to trade with the Banda Islands, they wanted to own them. Every tree, every harvest, every single route back to Europe. The Portuguese had been here for decades, building relationships, making deals. The Dutch burned their ships in the harbour. The Arab traders who'd been coming here for centuries? Their warehouses went up in flames overnight. Chinese merchants found their cargo holds mysteriously full of seawater. This wasn't competition anymore. This was elimination. By 1605, the VOC had warships patrolling every sea lane between the Banda Islands and Europe. Anyone carrying nutmeg without their permission simply disappeared. Ships, crews, cargo, gone. Think about that for a second. A company, not a country, a company, had declared war on the entire spice trade. And they were winning. The economics were staggering. A single pound of nutmeg bought in Banda for the equivalent of $1 could sell in Amsterdam for $300. But only if you could get it there alive. The VOC made sure nobody else could. They built the first corporate navy in history, 43 warships patrolling the Indian Ocean, each one flying company colours instead of any national flag. Their captains had orders to sink any vessel carrying spices from unauthorised sources. Even the Portuguese Empire, which had ruled these waters for a century, couldn't compete with that level of organised violence. But the real genius wasn't in the fighting. It was in what they did to the islands themselves. The Dutch didn't just control the trade routes, they controlled the source. Every nutmeg tree on every island had to be registered with the company. Any unauthorised harvest meant death. Not exile, not imprisonment. Death. Local chiefs who had negotiated with Europeans for generations suddenly found themselves signing contracts they couldn't read, agreeing to terms that turned them into employees of a company based 6,000 miles away. And it worked. By 1610, nutmeg prices in Europe had tripled, not because of scarcity, because of monopoly. The VOC was printing money with every ship that left the harbour. But they weren't satisfied with nutmeg. What they did next would make kings across Europe realise that the balance of power had shifted forever, and it all came down to one decision that even their own shareholders thought was madness. By 1616, the numbers were insane. The VOC was pulling in 12 million guilders a year from nutmeg alone. That's more than the entire French royal treasury. But it wasn't enough. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen stared at the ledgers from his fortress on Java. The new Governor-General was a different breed, cold, calculating, utterly ruthless. Where other men saw profit, Cohen saw a problem. The Bandanese were still there, still negotiating, still setting terms, still acting like they owned their own islands. These people, he wrote to Amsterdam, must be taught the difference between subjects and partners. The Bandanese had no idea what was coming. For 15 years they'd been playing the Dutch against other traders, driving up prices, maintaining their independence. They thought they were untouchable. After all, who would destroy the very people who knew how to grow the world's most valuable crop? Cohen had an answer. On a scorching morning in May 1621, 43 Dutch warships surrounded the tiny atoll of Lontor, not to trade, not to negotiate, to eliminate a problem once and for all. The Bandanese watched from their palm-thatched homes as marines poured onto their beaches. Children hid behind their mothers. Elders clutched ceremonial daggers that seemed pathetic against Dutch muskets. What happened next defied belief. Cohen's soldiers rounded up every man, woman, and child they could find. 15,000 people, nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands. The nutmeg growers, the families who had cultivated these trees for centuries. The very people who made the spice trade possible. And then they killed them. Not in battle, not in self-defense, systematically, methodically, like clearing weeds from a garden. Those who survived the initial massacre were loaded onto ships, sold as slaves across the Dutch Empire, scattered to plantations in Java, Ceylon, the Cape Colony, anywhere but the Banda Islands. Within 6 months, the Bandanese were gone. Cohen walked through empty villages where nutmeg trees hung heavy with fruit. No laughter, no children playing between the groves, just silence and the sweet smell of rotting spices. The islands, he reported to his directors, are now secure. The VOC had achieved the impossible. They didn't just control the spice trade anymore. They controlled the Spice Islands themselves. No more negotiating with local rulers, no more sharing profits with indigenous partners. Pure monopoly. Their accountants calculated the new margins with glee. Without Bandanese middlemen demanding their cut, profits would triple overnight. The company's stock price in Amsterdam soared to heights that made grown merchants weep with joy. But something else happened that the ledgers couldn't capture. The nutmeg trees began to die, and with them the very foundation of Dutch supremacy would start to crumble in ways no one could have predicted. The islands were secure, the spices flowed, and for 40 years the Dutch East India Company printed money. But Cohen had made one fatal miscalculation. By slaughtering the Bandanese, he'd destroyed the very people who knew how to cultivate nutmeg properly. The trees began dying, yields plummeted, and worse, smugglers started carrying nutmeg seeds to plantations in Ceylon, Mauritius, and the Caribbean. The monopoly was bleeding out through 1,000 tiny cuts. By 1780, nutmeg from British colonies flooded European markets at a fraction of the Dutch price. The spice that once cost more than gold now sold for less than pepper. The company that had conquered nations couldn't compete with free market forces. In 1799, the Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation, the empire that controlled more territory than Rome, declared bankruptcy. 2 centuries of dominance gone. But here's what's chilling about this story. It's happening again. Right now. Today's tech giants are the new spice traders. They don't fight over nutmeg. They fight over data. Your clicks, your searches, your location, your face. Every digital interaction is their nutmeg, and they'll do anything to control the harvest. Google doesn't just dominate search, it shapes what information exists. Amazon doesn't just sell products, it decides which businesses survive. Facebook doesn't just connect people, it controls how billions see reality. Just like the VOC, they've built empires worth more than most countries. Just like the VOC, they use their power to crush competition before it can breathe. And just like the VOC, they believe their dominance is permanent. They're wrong, because monopolies always carry the seeds of their own destruction. The very success that makes them untouchable makes them arrogant, complacent, blind to the forces building against them. The Bandanese understood something the Dutch forgot. True power doesn't come from controlling resources. It comes from understanding that everything changes. Empires rise, markets shift, and the mighty always fall. The company that once bought countries with pocket change was eventually sold for 60 million guilders. About what a decent house costs in Amsterdam today,